Hello, my name is Dale, and today I'm going to teach you a couple things about stone tool making, otherwise known as flintknapping. So first we're going to start with the kind of stone that you need. Not any stone is going to work for this. It needs to be two things in particular, siliceous and conchoidal fracturing. Now siliceous just means that it has a pretty high silica content, so it's pretty uniform throughout, which certainly helps the process. And conchoidal fracturing is just a fancy word for what you can see here. So each of these divots are places that I struck the stone and a flake was drawn off in these areas. Okay, that's a conchoidal fracture, so it'll tend to spread out like this. So the point of impact, and then it'll spread out. These ridges are just from the adjacent flakes. Okay, now the flake that's going to come off of this is going to have the same properties. Okay, so when you're looking in the archaeological record and you find a bunch of rock chips that have these properties, you can pretty much say that humans had something to do with it. Now here's one flake here. You can see here's the bulb of percussion, and that corresponds with that divot. Okay, so this didn't come off this piece, but essentially that's how it'll peel off like that. So when you're making stone tools, you're essentially chipping away the stone, and the stone, the way that you chip, is predictable enough for you to decide how you want that to look. Okay, so I could go on and on about it, but I'll just show you. First things first, put on some safety goggles. You don't want obsidian in the eye. One other thing, different stones to use. One is obsidian. It's volcanic glass. Dacite is another good one. It's also volcanic glass, a bit more opaque than obsidian. You can use cherts and flints. Those work well. Quartzite will do the trick, though it's a bit harder to work. Even something like petrified wood, if it's silicified enough, so if it has enough silica content in it, it'll work. Okay, so hopefully you can see there. But I'm gonna tell you about two more things before I hit this stone. One is what you're gonna use. Okay, here I have an antler billet, and this is what people often used in the past. The nice thing about these is they're durable, yet they have a bit of flex to them. So a modern tool that people will use to try and emulate this will be copper. So here's a copper billet. So there's just a copper cap on the end, and it acts similar to the way that antler will act. Okay, if you're using if you have a particularly hard stone, you can use another stone to break it. I'm not going to use a stone to break this obsidian because it's just going to shatter, because obsidian's pretty fragile. Okay, so these different tools, this is known as hard hammer percussion because it's a hard hammer. This is soft hammer percussion. It's just softer than a rock. Okay, and we'll talk about pressure flaking in a minute. I'm going to demonstrate percussion flaking for you using this copper billet. So what you want to do is you want to find, it takes a while to learn this, but you want to find a part in the stone that acts essentially a platform for you to strike, to then draw flakes off. So there's a lot of variables that go on in this. There's how hard you hit it, at what angle you hit it at, depending on what kind of stone it is, all sorts of things. For the sake of this, I'm just going to, you also want to grind the edge. If you don't grind where you're going to strike, it's going to shatter. You don't want that. You want to draw off a nice flake. So just like this. So I've struck a flake off here. You can see. So you're essentially peeling away layers of this stone to shape what you want. Now this flake has properties to it. This is the ventral side. This is the dorsal side. The dorsal side will have flake scars from previous flakes that you drew off. The ventral side will have none. It'll also have some nice ripples, and it will have a bulb of percussion right here. So this is the thicker portion. It will also have a proximal end and a distal end. The proximal end is the place that you struck it from, and the distal end is as it fans out. There are different kinds of flakes too. This is a feather termination, so it flaked nicely. Sometimes it'll stop halfway. We call that a step fracture or a hinge fracture, depending on how it looks. But the idea is to go down your core. This is a core here. It's a bifacial core because it's been worked on both sides. And to draw flakes around this piece, eventually working it into something like this, for instance. This is a biface. So it's a biface because it's been flaked on both sides. And it's starting to become lens shaped, and it's going in the direction that I want it to go. There's all sorts of different bifaces here that I've been working on, of different types of raw material. Okay, and then eventually you're going to get to, say, your finished product. So here is a big Clovis blade that I've made. Now you can see all those little conchoidal scars, and those are actually not done by percussion flaking. They're too small for that. I've done that by pressure flaking. Okay, pressure flaking is a bit different, and it involves taking your tool. This is usually for more refined work. You'll take, let's say, we'll use this biface for instance. Here's a biface. You're usually going to want some extra padding along with your glove. I use some rawhide. Take my biface. First, I'm going to grind the edge again. So I'm using a harder stone to do this. And then you're going to take, you can take an antler tine, or you can take, this is just part of an antler that I'm using here. And instead of striking it to draw off a flake, you're going to use pressure, okay? So same idea, you're drawing off little flakes by using the pressure that you apply rather than percussion. So using percussion at this stage is a bit riskier, because if you miss, if you're not quite, as accurate as you want to be, you might just break this in half, okay? The better you are, the more risks you can take in that regard. What else can I tell you? Well, you can just get the idea. We'll take a nice chunk of obsidian here, dragon glass. If you watch Game of Thrones, you can't forge it, by the way. You have to flake it. They screwed that up, but only us nerds know about that. Okay, so I'm just grinding the place that I'm going to strike. And drawing flakes from it. Working around the piece, like so. So the idea is just to start working this irregular piece of stone into something more uniform. And you can pretty much do anything you want. Once you get the idea down, you can make any sort of shape, okay? All sorts of different stones work. So here's some porcelainite. This is from Montana. Here's a type of chert from Mexico. It's pretty nice looking. Obsidian always looks pretty cool, but it is pretty brittle. So something that that's something to keep in mind too. The type of tool you're making. If it's going to be an arrowhead, it's okay if it's brittle, because it's going to do its thing. It's going to shoot through the air and stab into whatever you want to, stab it into. If you're using, if you need an end scraper or something, you might learn about this in class for scraping hide. You're not going to use obsidian, it's too brittle. You're going to get all sorts of little obsidian shards around. So you're going to use something tougher like quartzite or a coarser grained chert. So that's about it for now. Hopefully you learned a couple things.